The doctor's voice was heavy with a truth I didn't want to hear. My cancer had progressed to the middle stages, and the odds were slipping away. He spoke of active treatments and slim possibilities. But I already knew my answer. I was going home. 2 hours later, I stepped out into the sunlight. Chemotherapy had taken its toll, leaving me with thinning hair and a body that felt like a hollow shell. Survival rates were low, and fighting a losing battle felt pointless. It was time to stop pretending there was hope in these sterile walls. I had worked so hard, climbing the corporate ladder for years. But now all I had to show for it was a terminal diagnosis and a dwindling bank account. I spent $500,000 just to stay alive, yet I'd never truly lived. My existence had been nothing but a dull, tedious grind. I bought a ticket to my hometown, Dongcheng. As the high-speed train blurred the world outside, I felt a strange sense of finality. A bus ride later, I was back in the suburbs. The familiar air of the countryside began to fill my lungs, bringing back memories of a happier time. My old home was waiting for me, a farmhouse surrounded by an abandoned orchard. It was the legacy my parents left behind before they passed. The orchard was barren now, choked by weeds and neglect. It was a reflection of my own life, wasted on things that didn't matter. I pushed open the door and was greeted by the smell of dust and nostalgia. This was where I would spend my final days. I resolved to embrace this simple country life. No more deadlines, no more stress, just the quiet peace of the end. After cleaning the dusty room, I collapsed onto the bed, completely out of breath. Even the simplest task felt like a mountain climb. Suddenly, a strange noise cut through the silence. A rhythmic ringing was coming from outside in the yard. I stood up and followed the sound into the empty orchard. There, hidden among the weeds, I saw something impossible. It was a black beetle the size of a wash basin, perfectly round and unervingly still. Its shell was a black so deep it seemed to swallow the light. I couldn't look away. It was like a black hole drawing me in. I reached out, my curiosity overriding my caution. The moment my fingers touched the shell, the world vanished. My mind was suddenly pulled into a vast ocean of ancient memories. I saw the rise of an entire race, the Tyrannies. They were born on a lush green planet, evolving with a speed that defied nature. They developed science and technology far beyond human comprehension. They reached for the stars, driven by an innate potential for greatness. But their ambition led them to a higher dimension, Eternia. It was a realm of fantasy and power they weren't prepared to face. The beings of Eternia held world-shattering might in their tiny forms. The glorious Tyrannies' civilization was crushed in an instant. Memories faded, leaving me trembling. Compared to the death of a civilization that lasted eons, my own end felt small. I looked at the beetle, the hive mother, now defeated and alone. We were both just souls waiting for the end. I asked her if she had any last words. I treated her not as a monster, but as a queen deserving of a final farewell. The hive mother seemed surprised by my lack of fear. She realized that in the face of death, an emperor and an ant are equals. She laughed, a sound that echoed in my mind like a conversation between old friends. She began to speak of her long, cosmic life. She told me that bigger isn't always better in evolution. The smaller the body, the easier it is to build a stable foundation of energy. She offered me her legacy, her authority, and the coordinates to Eternia. She wanted me to become the next creator. I sat there for 10 minutes, trying to process the impossible. The authority over the Tyrannies hive was now mine. The Tyrannies had only one true racial ability: accelerated cell division. It was a power that could compress eons into days. While it shortened an organism's lifespan, it also accelerated the very process of evolution itself. I felt my breath quicken. On Earth, life took billions of years to reach its peak. But with this power, a species could evolve in the blink of an eye. The hive mother was a biological war fortress, capable of populating entire worlds. I realized I held the key to infinite possibilities. I couldn't populate a planet, but I could start right here in my courtyard. I would create a primordial ocean in the garden pond. Tyranny's spores could spread anywhere. They were the seeds of life, waiting for a master to give them purpose. I would landscape the yard, creating miniature mountains, lakes, and rivers. It would be a physical model of a new Earth. In this sandbox, I would unleash the spores and watch them evolve. I was no longer a dying man. I was a creator. The speed of the tyrannies meant I didn't have to wait millions of years. I would see results in just a few days. This was my chance to leave a mark on the world, even if it was a world of my own making. My enthusiasm was finally back. The silence of the countryside was about to be replaced by the roar of evolution. My journey was just beginning. To build a miniature Earth right here. And within this sandbox, I would let the spores of a dead empire create something entirely new. Suji was physically and mentally exhausted, drained by the relentless torture of chemotherapy. In these final days, he wondered if his life had any point at all. But suddenly, a new spark ignited within him. He had found something that truly interested him: the study of evolution. He decided to use his remaining time to build an evolutionary sandbox right in his yard. He smiled, thinking it felt just like playing a game of Minecraft. Dragged out an old, dusty tricycle from a dark corner. Even this small effort left him panting like an old man. Despite his weakened body, he pedaled into town. He was determined to spend his savings on the tools he needed for his grand experiment. He spent nearly 40,000 yuan on landscaping equipment. He returned home with everything necessary to reshape the earth. The area he chose was modest, only about 100 square meters. It was time to begin the work of a creator. With a hose and a hoe, he carefully shaped small mountains, rivers, and deep caverns. He was crafting a world from nothing. Next, he used a high-temperature tool to grill every inch of the soil. He had to ensure no local life would interfere with his experiment. Microorganisms were left alone, as they would simply be assimilated by the tyranny's spores. They would become the foundation for something new. Finally, he began working on the ocean, the origin of all life. He dug a large pond covering 40 square meters in the center. He added salt to the water, mimicking the exact ratio of the Earth's oceans. The cradle of life was ready. He realized his world wasn't a round planet, but a square sandbox. It felt like the ancient myth where the sky is round and the Earth is square. After a week of grueling labor, the setup was complete. He commanded the tyranny's hive to begin mass-producing spores. He deposited them into the artificial ocean. At that moment, the evolution of a new world truly began. He gave his first command to the hive: accelerate cell division by 10,000 units. He wanted to see results fast. At this speed, a single day in his yard would be equivalent to 10,000 years for the life forms within. Time was now his tool. However, this created a harsh environment. Each cycle meant 5,000 years of constant daylight, followed by 5,000 years of total darkness. On the first day, the water remained perfectly clear. By the second and third days, there was still only silence. Fourth day passed with nothing, but on the fifth, plankton finally appeared. The water began to turn visibly cloudy with life. By the sixth day, the plankton evolved into flea-sized organisms. A vibrant green color began to spread across his man-made ocean. Suji frowned, realizing he needed to maintain control. He commanded the hive to set genetic locks on the organism's size. He couldn't allow them to grow too large for his yard. He knew that staying small was the true path to qualitative evolution. He locked their size so that even a creature as advanced as a dinosaur would be no larger than a common house cat. Later that day, the great upheaval began. Millions of years of evolution were condensed into a single afternoon. It was like watching a documentary on fast forward. Species were born, matured, and died in the span of a few seconds. As the sun began to set, Suji grew worried. The coming darkness was an ominous portent for his tiny world. His condensed timeline meant the plants would face 5,000 years of night. Without photosynthesis, they would surely perish. As the darkness took hold, the flourishing plants began to wilt. In seconds, vast swaths of green sank to the bottom of the sea. The first mass extinction had begun. The once vibrant ocean was now a silent, dead graveyard. Suji took a deep breath, watching the devastation. He compared it to the great extinctions of Earth's own history. He whispered a plea for his spores to hold on. He didn't want his world to die, just as it had started to evolve. Earth was vast and resilient, but his sandbox was tiny. The chances of survival seemed impossibly slim. Yet, he knew the tyranny cells were terrifyingly adaptable. If anything could survive this darkness, it was them. He waited in the silence of the night. After half an hour, a faint change began to occur on the surface of the sea. Pale blue color started to emerge from the darkness. It was the glow of a new kind of life. Soaking in the moonlight, these newborn plants began to do the impossible. They were photosynthesizing in the middle of the night. He had witnessed the first miracle of his sandbox. Evolution had found a way to overcome the 5,000 years of darkness. His experiment wasn't a failure. It was a success beyond his wildest dreams. The tyranny's spores were truly extraordinary. The lonely courtyard was now home to a thriving, glowing ecosystem. Suji felt a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. As the moon hung high, the world below continued to change. This was only the beginning of the evolutionary journey. Tiny blue plants, no larger than ants, floated delicately across the water. They were the first signs of life in this miniature world. Without any direct sunlight, they survived by feeding on the pale, silver glow of the moon. In the blink of an eye, these plants grew, matured, and died. It was evolution happening at a terrifying speed. It felt like watching a home video playing on fast forward. The plants were adapting frantically to their night environment. Their shapes shifted into rhomboids and discs, evolving to catch every single drop of moonlight. With no competition, the species Suji named blue moongrass began to conquer the sea. Soon, the entire ocean was transformed into a beautiful, glowing azure landscape. As hours passed, tens of thousands of generations lived and died, splitting into dozens of subspecies. But nature is never just peaceful. A darker branch of the species soon emerged. These carnivorous plants used a soft glow to lure their own kind, devouring them to survive. Suji marveled at the tenacity of life. Even in this tiny yard, the law of the fittest was absolute. He pulled out a notebook, decided to record every step of this world's long history. He called this era the Dark Age, 5,000 years of simulated darkness where the moon ruled the sky. For a terminally ill man, this was more than a project. This was fun, real fun. He wrote how the blue moongrass became the sole masters of the ocean after the first great extinction. Despite his exhaustion from chemotherapy, his spirits had never been higher. He stayed awake all night, waiting for the next step. He expected to see the first marine animals appear. As the seventh day began, the sun finally rose. And with it came a nightmare. The plants that thrived in the gentle moonlight couldn't handle the sun's heat. They began to wither instantly. The very structures that made them efficient at absorbing light now became their death sentence. In minutes, the beautiful azure ocean turned into a gruesome gray graveyard of floating corpses. Suji watched as a world that took hours to build was wiped out in moments. This was the second mass extinction. Over 90% of all life in the sandbox vanished. Where there is death, there is also opportunity for the resilient. By the afternoon, a small blue patch reappeared. A new mutation had survived the scorching sun. This plant evolved a unique pentagram shape, changing its color to a mystical deep violet. It learned to open its leaves at night to drink moonlight and close them tightly during the day to hide from the sun. Suji laughed, impressed by the survivor. He decided to give it a name worthy of its strength. "You have withstood the fiery sun and the endless dark," he whispered. "I shall call you Violet Herograss." The Dark Age was over. A new era had begun, and he called it the Radiant Age. The once weak offshoot was now the protagonist of the world, flourishing where others had failed. He felt a strange connection to these tiny plants. They were both fighting against impossible odds to survive. The cycle of life continued, faster and more brutal than ever. What would the next era bring? The scorching sun of the sixth day finally dipped below the horizon, giving way to the seventh night. In the deep blue of the miniature ocean, the violet hero grass flourished like never before. It had wiped out nearly all other species, surviving a mass extinction to dominate the waters. It was the perfect survivor for a world where days lasted 5,000 years. Because of this massive green spread, photosynthesis went into overdrive. The oxygen levels in the water began to skyrocket, preparing the stage for something new. The conditions were finally perfect for the birth of complex life. Deep in the shadows, the very first marine creatures began to stir. Soon, the first invertebrates appeared, looking like small black beetles. They resembled ancient horseshoe crabs, scuttling across the seabed. Life had officially entered its grand evolutionary stage. The sandbox was about to witness a massive explosion of diversity. Watching these tiny creatures, Suji couldn't help but smile. He had waited so long through 2 mass extinctions to see this moment, but his body was at its limit after being awake for a day and night. The exhaustion of his illness finally caught up with him. He stumbled back to his room and collapsed into a deep sleep. The world outside continued to evolve while he rested. He finally woke up. It was already the 8th day of creation. Sunlight filled the room, but his stomach was growling with hunger. He knew he had to take care of himself if he wanted to see his experiment through. A terminally ill man couldn't afford to skip meals or hygiene. Leaving his compound, he pedaled his bicycle down a quiet countryside path. The air was incredibly fresh, a stark contrast to his failing health. He enjoyed the warmth of the sun on his skin as he headed toward the small town nearby. It was a rare moment of peace in his race against time. After a quiet breakfast in town, he felt a bit more energized. He finished his meal and began the journey back home. By the time he returned, it was just after 9 o'clock. He immediately rushed to the sandbox to see what had changed during his absence. The tiny ocean was now teeming with life. In just one night, the ecosystem had transformed into a bustling underwater world. The violet hero grass had evolved into countless strange variations. Some looked like swaying fans, while others resembled tangled vines. But the real masters of this era were the arthropods. Their sturdy exoskeletons acted as impenetrable armor against any threat. Among them, a creature similar to a trilobite dominated the waters. It had developed something revolutionary, the very first pair of eyes. With sight and heavy armor, they were unstoppable predators. Every other organism in the sea was now nothing more than prey. Suji was stunned to see such a game-changing organ appear so quickly. Sight changed everything in the struggle for survival. The blind species were quickly eliminated by these new hunters. Soon, the entire ocean entered a new era where sight was mandatory for survival. However, the reign of the invertebrates didn't last forever. By the 9th day, a new dominant species emerged, the vertebrates. Unlike their armored ancestors, these creatures had their skeletons on the inside. It seemed like a step backward in defense, but it gave them something better. They were incredibly dexterous and fast. While the invertebrates were slow tanks, these fish were agile fighters that couldn't be caught. Suji watched the stalemate with a laugh while peeling an apple. It was a fascinating battle between heavy armor and high mobility. On the 10th day, the balance of power finally broke. A new mutation appeared that would change the world forever. A species of redfish had evolved jaws and teeth. This was the second revolutionary weapon in the history of the sandbox. Those powerful jaws could easily bite through the thickest invertebrate armor. The once invincible shells were now being cracked open like eggs. The era of vertebrates had finally arrived. This little fish was the ancestor of all future rulers, including humans. But some creatures were already looking beyond the ocean. They began to evolve into amphibians, leaving the competitive waters for the empty land. Plants followed soon after, turning the barren landscape into patches of green. However, they remained tiny due to the genetic limits Suji had set. This world, bigger wasn't better. Concentrated energy in a small body could lead to extraordinary potential and qualitative changes. Suji began a new page in his records, naming this era the Revival Age. It was a time of explosive growth and heroic competition. He detailed how vertebrates defeated the armored giants to become the true masters. With the record finished, he closed the book silently. He estimated that by the time he finished his next meal, terrestrial species would be fully established. The spores were evolving faster than he ever imagined. However, a new concern crossed his mind. How long would it take for true intelligence to appear in this tiny ecosystem? He considered using his own blood to jumpstart the process. His genes could potentially create intelligent humanoid creatures in record time. The thought of human experimentation made him uneasy. He needed a different source of genetic material to spark intelligence. He remembered the local zoo, and a plan began to form. If he could get genetic samples from monkeys, the real game would finally begin. A few hours later, Suji stepped into the zoo. He felt like a ghost walking through a world of happy families and laughing couples. He was a lone adult male in a place meant for joy, standing out like a sore thumb. People didn't see a visitor. They saw a spectacle. A young boy nearby tugged on his father's sleeve, pointing at Suji's head. He whispered that the man looked strong because he was balding. The father shook his head, telling his son that the man wasn't a hero, just a pitiable soul ravaged by illness. They had no idea he could hear every word. Suji didn't feel pitiful at all. He knew that by tomorrow, this balding youth would evolve into something far beyond human. He ignored the gossip and focused on the healthiest monkey in the exhibit. It was time to find a manager and put his plan into motion. He introduced himself as a medical student working on a research project. He claimed he needed a sample of monkey blood for his thesis. The manager looked at Suji's thinning hair and believed the lie. He assumed the stress of being a top student was the cause. But the old man refused to help, claiming he loved the monkey like his own son. He swore he wouldn't give in to threats or bribes. Suji didn't say a word. He simply pulled out 3,000 yuan and laid the cash on the table. The manager's eyes instantly lit up with greed. That was an entire month's salary sitting right in front of him. Suddenly, his son wasn't so precious anymore. He happily offered to give Suji even more blood than he asked for. Suji left the office with a devilish smile. He had the resources, and he wasn't afraid to use them. He had the monkey blood he needed. Next, he would need other samples, like peacocks and cranes. On his way home, he spotted some termites near the road. They were small, but their strength relative to their size was legendary. He added them to his collection of genetic materials. If he was going to rebuild life, he needed the best traits nature had to offer. As evening approached, Suji reached the gates of his family home. He felt a strange sense of power despite his sickly appearance. A voice suddenly called out his name from the road. He turned to see a beautiful girl on an electric scooter staring at him. It was Chun-Shi, a childhood friend he hadn't seen in years. She had grown into a stunning young woman with a radiant smile. Her joy quickly turned to horror as she took in his gaunt face and thinning hair. She could hardly believe this was the same person. Suji didn't try to hide it. He simply told her the truth: stomach cancer and chemotherapy. Chun-Shi was stunned into silence. He had been the pride of their village, a successful manager with a bright future. Now, he looked like he had come home just to wait for the end. She desperately tried to change the subject, mentioning her own college life. Suji gave her a brief wish of good luck. His mind was already elsewhere, focused on the world waiting behind his gates. He was anxious to see what his tyranny's species had become. While he was away, hours had passed, centuries in their time. Chun-Shi called out to him, offering her help if he ever needed anything. She watched her former idol walk away with a heavy heart. Suji sighed as he closed the gate. He was tired of the melancholic faces and the constant staring at his balding head. He stood over his pond, ready to lose himself in his creation. The pity of others didn't matter when you were God. Miniature world was exploding with life. Every corner of the 100-square-meter sandbox was teeming with activity. In just 10 days, single-celled organisms had evolved into complex ecosystems. Biodiversity had reached terrifying levels. Creatures had left the sea and adapted to freshwater rivers. They all shared one trait: they were fundamentally insectoid. If not for his absolute control, these species would have already overrun the earth. He was the only thing keeping them contained. He accepted his role as the evil scientist of this world. It was time to conduct a genocidal experiment for the sake of progress. He prepared the monkey and termite genes. Most species would die, but the survivors would become the ancient insect apes. Suji pulled on his blue plastic boots. He was about to step into his creation and change the course of history. He stepped into the testing ground, trampling over countless ant-sized plants and animals. To them, he was a natural disaster. He didn't care about the loss of life. In this world, survival of the fittest was the only rule that mattered. Being crushed by his boot simply meant they were unlucky. They were being eliminated by natural selection. He squatted down, searching for the perfect subject. He needed a species with the potential to evolve into something like a human. He smiled as he made his final decision. If he was going to create a new dominant race, he had one specific requirement. They had to be bald. It was time for the world to know the power of a naturally bald species. After an exhaustive search, Suji finally found the perfect candidate for his next experiment. It was a beetle-like creature, uniquely built with a vertebrate skeleton and black chitinous armor. This species was the best of both worlds, possessing the dexterity of a vertebrate and the protection of an insect. Most importantly, its armored head meant it would be naturally hairless. Suji carefully picked up the beetle with metal tongs. He whispered to it, calling it the lucky overlord of the coming epochs, dropped the specimen into a clear test tube, and prepared a new testing field. It was time to see if this creature could handle the next stage of evolution. He scattered food across a tiny square meter of land. With everything in place, he activated the mother hive's power to accelerate cell division by 10,000 units. In mere 10 seconds, the population exploded. Where there was once one beetle, there were now over 100,000. Suji placed a series of transparent tubes on the ground. He commanded the swarm to line up and enter them, 300 per tube. Under the absolute influence of the mother hive, the creatures obeyed without question. They marched into their designated tubes like a tiny, chitinous army. After numbering each tube, the real test began. He diluted monkey blood and introduced it into every single one of them. He ordered the beetles to pierce themselves, mixing their fluids with the foreign blood. The resulting reaction was instantaneous and lethal. It was a brutal process of survival of the fittest. Millions died as their bodies rejected the new genetic material. After 2 days and countless generations of death, signs of success finally appeared. 3 test tubes contained survivors that had accepted the blood. Suji focused on the most successful specimen from tube number 2041. It was an ant-sized creature that looked like an ape covered in black armor. He named it the bug ape, but there was one problem. Despite his hopes for a hairless species, this creature had a luxurious head of hair. The tiny ape was furious, banging its fists against the glass wall. It let out odd, incoherent cries that filled the quiet room. Suji listened closely as the syllables began to form a recognizable pattern. At first, it sounded like Badi. Then, the roar transformed into a word that hit him like a punch. Baldy. Baldy. Suji was dumbfounded. He had created this life, only for it to mock his thinning hair caused by chemotherapy. He felt a sudden urge to crush the impertinent little thing. No creator should be mocked by their own creation like this. He called the species a treacherous, warlike scourge. But then he remembered how much work it took to create this single success. He decided to spare it for now, but he wrote its name in a mental notebook. This grudge wouldn't be forgotten easily. Suji reintroduced the bug ape into the test field and let it reproduce. He ramped the acceleration back up to 10,000 units. The original bug ape died quickly, but its descendants multiplied into tens of thousands. They looked up at the giant in the sky and shrieked in unison. A chorus of Baldi echoed from the sandbox. Suji's face turned red with rage as he realized his entire creation was mocking him. He tried to integrate termite genes to change them, but the experiment failed repeatedly. Over 70 attempts resulted in nothing but silence for the mockers. The genetic mix was too chaotic for such a low-level species to handle. He had to set the termite genes aside for now. He waited for the bug apes to show signs of intelligence, but they remained primitive. Generation after generation passed with no progress. It hit him. At 10,000 units of acceleration, a lifespan was only a few seconds. How could they build a civilization if they died before they could even think? They were stuck in a cycle of pure instinct. He searched the Mother Hive's database for a solution. He needed a balance between evolution speed and cognitive function. He discovered that at 100 units of acceleration, their brains could withstand the side effects. Their thoughts would accelerate along with their bodies. Suji adjusted the speed. Suddenly, the bug apes moved with such velocity that they left afterimages behind. It was as if they were constantly in a state of hyperfocus. Their cells burned life energy to maintain this incredible pace. The tyranny's racial ability was truly terrifying. By reducing the speed, he had traded rapid evolution for sentient thought. Curious thought crossed his mind. He asked the hive mind if he could apply this acceleration to himself. The answer was a cold no. To use it, he would need to implant tyranny's cells into his own body. Even if he could, it would be a death sentence. Accelerating his cells would cause his cancer to reach its final stage instantly. Meanwhile, on the other side of the sandbox, life had continued to evolve at 10,000 units. A primitive, giant world had taken shape. There were soaring trees and dinosaur-like species. The largest was a cat-sized crustacean that dominated the land. To the ant-sized bug apes, these creatures were like gods. Suji wondered how his little mockers would survive such a world. He decided to slow down the entire sandbox to 100 units. He hoped the native species might also develop sentience over time. The experiment was ready. Wearing protective boot covers, Suji stepped into the miniature world he had created. He walked past verdant valleys and trampled through diminutive forests. To the inhabitants below, he was a walking natural disaster. He reached a large, tree-covered canyon in the south. This would be the birthplace of the bug ape civilization. He carefully dropped the 300 survivors into the canyon. These were the warriors he had high hopes for. He wanted to see if they could develop tools and build a society. It would be a waste if they were simply wiped out by natural selection. Despite their mockery, he respected their tenacity. They were the first sentient spark in his new world. The stage was set for a new era. Now, the creator would watch and see if his children could conquer the giants. Early the next morning, Suji stepped out of bed and looked out at his lush, green courtyard. This idyllic life was exactly what he had always dreamed of. But this wasn't just any farm. It was a sanctuary for creatures far beyond human understanding. Thanks to the mother hive's mental manipulation, no outsider could see the tiny, fantastical world hidden here. He headed to the bathroom for a shower, checking his reflection in the mirror afterward. To his surprise, he looked far more energetic than before. The hair he'd lost during chemotherapy was finally growing back, thick and black once more. His skin, once sickly pale, now had a healthy glow. Reflected, there was a handsome, well-built young man with sharp features. Though still slightly pale, he looked more like a powerful vampire than a dying patient. He realized his body was absorbing energy from the extinct Tyranny's life forms. The sheer quantity of souls he had processed was finally paying off, but a dark shadow remained in his mind. No matter how strong his body became, the cancer cells grew stronger alongside him. Despite the grim reality, his mood was bright. He hopped on his bike and rode toward the far side of town for breakfast. Fresh air and the smell of the paddy fields filled him with nostalgia. It was a simple, grounding atmosphere that he had missed dearly. Suddenly, an elderly woman carrying a basket of vegetables blocked his path. It was the woman the villagers called the Pig Lady. She looked him up and down, asking if it was true that he was back. Then, she leaned in and whispered about his illness. When he confirmed he had cancer, she gasped dramatically. She immediately started worrying about the Su family line dying out. Without missing a beat, she offered to introduce him to her daughter. She wanted him to have children before it was too late. Suji felt a wave of suspicion. Did she just want him to marry her daughter so they could inherit his city earnings after he passed? Before he could refuse, a familiar voice cut through the air. It was Chun-Shi, running toward them with a group of middle-aged women. He told Suji to ignore the Pig Lady, calling her daughter ugly and ill-tempered. The older woman turned red with rage. Seeing the crowd of women surrounding her, the Pig Lady scurried away. Chun-Shi then turned to Suji and froze in shock. She couldn't believe her eyes. Just a few days ago, he was balding and frail, but now he looked like a completely different person. Chun-Shi's mother, Aunt Li, stepped forward with a warm smile. She scolded her daughter, insisting that Suji had always been this handsome. She invited him over for a visit, and the other ladies joined in the enthusiastic welcome. Suji couldn't help but feel moved by their kindness. She was left behind, stomping her feet in frustration. She was certain he had been bald as a monk just the other day. Suji sat in Aunt Lee's traditional courtyard, listening to the elderly ladies talk. They were heartbroken to hear about his illness and nagged him like family. Being around them brought back a flood of childhood memories. For the first time in years, he felt truly relaxed and at peace. Before he left, they showered him with homegrown fruits and vegetables. They told him to stay in the village and focus on getting better. Suji promised to visit often, his heart warmed by their genuine concern. This was the kind of community he had forgotten existed. Meanwhile, Chun-Shi was still in a daze, convinced Su Ji was a body double. She couldn't wrap her head around how he could look like a manga character overnight. Su Ji pretended not to hear her, maintaining his cool exterior while smiling like an idiot inside. Regaining his hair felt like regaining his very dignity. He decided then and there to leave the busy city life behind for good. He would live out his days in the simple warmth of his hometown. As soon as he got home, his thoughts returned to his miniature world. He was eager to see how his bug apes had evolved in his absence. In the sandbox world, 80 years had passed while he was out. Time moved at a staggering pace compared to the real world. He stood on a chair and used binoculars to observe from a distance. He didn't want his presence to disrupt the fragile ecosystem again. He saw that the bug apes had developed rudimentary tribal structures. They were living in groups, showing the beginnings of language and culture. But something was wrong. Despite their progress, the entire species seemed to be on the brink of total extinction. The 80 years of struggle had pushed them to their limits. Su Ji watched closely, wondering if his creation was about to vanish forever. The cycle of darkness and light had taken its toll on the primitive civilization. Survival was becoming an impossible task for the tiny creatures. He needed to understand what had gone wrong during those 80 years. Was it the environment, or were the bug apes simply not strong enough to endure? The energy feedback from their deaths was what made him healthy, but he didn't want them all to die out just yet. He needed a stable civilization. He was their god, their creator, and their destroyer. Every choice he made determined the fate of millions of tiny lives. With his health returning and his mind clear, he prepared to intervene. The next era of the sandbox world was about to begin. As he looked closer, he saw something he didn't expect. The bug apes weren't just dying, they were changing. In the wild, nature is an open book, but sentience brings a strange new feeling: shame. It seems absurd, but the first thing an intelligent species does is cover themselves up. Su Ji watched this unfolding through his binoculars. He had finally stopped the rapid acceleration of time. He hoped that by waiting, a true civilization would naturally emerge from the chaos. The bug apes were now covering their private parts with small pieces of grass. Shame was the ultimate sign of sentience. Su Ji couldn't help but smile. They were finally developing language instead of just screaming insults. But there was a problem. They were on the very edge of extinction. They were simply too weak to survive the world he had created. 20,000 years of evolution had passed while they were gone. Now, they were out of touch with the times. Their ancient genes didn't provide the tools needed to fight off modern feral beasts. Su Ji realized his interference had brought them into a world far too violent for their current stage. In this sandbox, it was a constant Jurassic era. Giant predators were everywhere, and the bug apes were falling behind. Intelligence takes generations to accumulate, but they didn't have that kind of time. He couldn't let them go extinct. It was time for a divine intervention. He logged into Taba and began searching for specific items. He was going to grant them the spark of civilization. With a few clicks, the orders were placed. Now, they just had to survive until the delivery arrived. That afternoon, Su Ji took a break and rode his bicycle through the countryside. He ran into Chun-Shi by chance. As usual, she was full of questions and energy. He watched him closely, wondering if he was even the real Su Ji. Her curiosity was becoming a bit much. He refused her request to visit his home. He couldn't risk her stepping into his sandbox and wiping out a whole species. The next morning, his packages arrived right on time. Inside was a miniature juniper tree and a custom-made item. The sword was tiny, but to the bug apes, it would be a legendary weapon of the gods. He returned to the courtyard and stopped the time acceleration. It was time to see if they had survived. The scene in the valley was grim. Corpses were scattered everywhere, and the smell of death hung heavy. The Aura were coming. These gaunt, black beasts were relentless predators. The bug ape warriors bellowed in their primitive tongue, telling the others to run. They prepared for a final, desperate stand. But courage wasn't enough. They were being chewed to pieces by the raptors. The hive mind watched dispassionately. To it, these were just cannon fodder unless they could ascend. Su Ji asked what it meant to ascend. The answer was more complex than he expected. Ascension meant breaking genetic locks. A hero doesn't just evolve. They control their own genes. These heroes would lead their species to the upper echelons of the Tyrannies race. The hive mind believed it was possible. The bug apes had unique potential buried in their monkey genes. Su Ji finally stepped forward. The ground trembled with every movement of his massive feet. Mountains were flattened, and rivers stopped flowing. To the creatures below, it was the end of the world. The terrifying aura were stomped into the dirt before they could even make a sound. Natural selection was swift. The fleeing bug apes turned their heads. They couldn't believe what they were seeing. A colossal giant, thousands of times larger than any beast they knew, towered over them. They screamed and fell to the ground in worship. To them, he was a god who had descended from the heavens. Suji could understand their crude language. He wondered what they felt looking at someone so immense. He was 10,000 feet tall in their eyes, a titan from ancient myths. Fear of the predators was replaced by a deep, soul-shaking awe. It was time to give him the gifts he had prepared. The spark of civilization was about to be lit. The giant hand reached down, carrying items that would change their destiny forever. He watched as the god placed a sacred tree and a divine blade upon the earth. The sword gleamed with a light they had never seen before. It was a weapon of pure power. He would not let his creation perish. He would guide them from the shadows and from the sky. The era of the bug apes had ended, and the era of the heroes was about to begin. Run away! The bug apes screamed as a massive shadow loomed over their tribe. They had faced beasts before, but nothing like this terrifying behemoth. Despair crushed them, for they were no bigger than a single strand of his hair. But amidst the chaos, one young bug ape stood his ground. He looked up at the sky, his voice trembling with a mix of rage and sorrow. He asked if this giant had come to finish what the other beasts started. Why? He wondered, were they so incredibly weak? Suji looked down, surprised by the tiny creature's courage. In that moment, he made a choice. He reached out and gently placed the bug ape on his palm. To the little creature, the hand felt like a vast, skin-textured continent. Looking up, Gilgamesh saw eyes like burning furnaces, bright as the sun. A sacred white light wreathed the giant's face, radiating pure divinity. Suji spoke, his voice echoing like thunder through the air. Gilgamesh, he said, "Do you want to change everything?" Young bug ape trembled, shocked that this titan could communicate. He wondered what kind of absolute existence stood before him. "And you call me Gilgamesh?" he asked. Suji replied calmly that names are an expression of wisdom. Suji began to stride across the landscape, stepping over mountains and rivers. Great swathes of trees were trampled beneath his feet. Let the tiny creature look down at the world from his height. His voice resounded through the heavens as he spoke. "Look upon the world, Gilgamesh," he said. "Before me, every species is equal." He asked why he should save them, just because they had intelligence. Gilgamesh was speechless, struck by the harsh truth. In despair, the young bug ape shouted, asking why the giant had even come looking for them then. "No one can save you," Suji declared. "Only you can save yourself." He promised to grant them the methods of civilization, master them, and they would finally have the power to protect themselves. "What is civilization?" Gilgamesh asked in amazement. He had never seen the world from such a sublime perspective. Suji realized he was now a teacher to this newborn race. He thought for a moment before giving his answer. "Civilization is fire," he said. "It is knowledge, order, and the greatest weapon an intelligent species can possess." Suji walked back to the canyon and planted a tiny juniper tree. To the miniature world, it was a divine tower stretching into the clouds. He told Gilgamesh that if he wanted the power of civilization, he must climb this divine tree. It was a test of wisdom and courage. At the highest branch, Suji placed 3 items. He called them the 3 treasures of civilization. First was the sword of Damocles, the weapon that separates men from beasts. It represented the power of tools. Next was the torch, which burned with a blazing flame. Mastering fire, he explained, was civilization's first step. Finally, there was the blood of the conqueror. Only the greatest warrior could drink it and survive to gain matchless power. He challenged the young king to reach the treasures before the torch was extinguished. Then, he simply walked away. Once outside the sandbox, Suji ordered the mother hive to accelerate cell division by 100 units. The world instantly became a blur of motion. Trees grew and withered in seconds as time itself seemed to warp. A match that would burn for 30 seconds in the real world became a torch that lasted for days in the sandbox. Through his binoculars, Suji watched the tiny ants struggle. They fell countless times only to climb back up with renewed resolve. To him, it was only 10 seconds. But for them, it was several hard days of failure and sweat. Finally, Gilgamesh reached the summit. He stood atop the lush canopy, raising the sword of Damocles high above his head. He looked down at the world, his naturally armored shoulders glimmering in the light. His face was filled with newfound confidence. We who possess wisdom will one day match the great beast. He roared to his tribe. He vowed that every member of his tribe would wield divine power and that behemoths would flee before their might. Thousands of years later, archaeologists would unearth the records of this moment in the ruins of the oldest empire. It was the Epic of Genesis, dedicated to their great monarch. It told the story of the great beast of wisdom. Records described a titan 10,000 feet tall, whose steps shattered the earth, and whose wisdom granted the treasures of life. It spoke of the young King Gilgamesh, who conquered the holy test and brought fire to his people. This was the birth of civilization. The age of heroes had finally begun. Back inside, Suji started boiling water for tea. The fire of civilization had finally been sparked in his miniature world. He thought of a young bug ape, a muscular creature he named Gilgamesh. He had high hopes for this first king. He had even granted the creature termite genes that others couldn't assimilate. Now it was all up to Gilgamesh to ascend. Later, Suji sat by the door, studying his vast courtyard. He realized most of the 500 square meters was still just weeds. He decided to start clearing the extra space, even if he didn't have a plan for it yet. Action was better than idleness. As for expanding the sandbox, he felt it wasn't necessary. Managing a larger area would only bring more headaches. Suddenly, a rhythmic knocking echoed from the front gate. Suji put down his tools to see who it was. It was Chun-Shi, carrying a heavy load of food. She looked at him with curiosity, noticing his sudden interest in gardening. He told her it was just exercise for the body. She couldn't see what was really happening inside the sandbox. Chun-Shi blushed, staring at his well-defined muscles. She couldn't believe a college graduate like him was turning into a farmer. She offered to help, mentioning her experience planting rice. She worried the yard was too much for one sick man to handle. Suji laughed it off, saying he just wanted to plant some interesting seeds. He teased that maybe he'd grow marvelous flowers. Chun-Shi cheered up and promised to bring him whatever food he wanted. Then, she skipped away with a final, thoughtless comment. She noted his hair was growing back and called it a final burst of vitality before death. Suji stood there, completely stunned. He grumbled about her disrespect, wondering if she thought this was his last supper. He was only in the middle stages of cancer. The meal smelled delicious, poached eggs and stir-fried greens. Despite his annoyance, he joyfully dug into the home-cooked food. He decided to take advantage of her offer for daily meals. A good diet was exactly what a stomach cancer patient needed. After a rest, he finished his chores and washed his muddy clothes. He realized he desperately needed a washing machine. The next day, Chun-Shi returned with more food. Suji accepted her sympathy with a smile, enjoying this idyllic lifestyle. To him, it had only been a single day of napping and eating. But inside the sandbox, 100 years had already passed. 2 generations of bug apes had come and gone. The torch of civilization was being passed through the fire. Gilgamesh had not died of old age yet. Instead, he had led his people to master the power of fire. With the sword of Damocles, he became an invincible hunter. He cleared the forest of beasts, giving his tribe room to breathe. The second decade, Gilgamesh was known as the Hero King. He introduced agriculture, burning forests to create fertile farmland. He developed the cuneiform system of writing to record their history. He named his own epic Genesis, calling himself the father of civilization. He was arrogant and brutal, yet full of charisma. He took over 100 wives, fathering many strong and wise offspring. Time spared no one. By his late 30s, the once mighty Hero King had become old and decrepit. He watched the fire, calling it a crimson flower dancing in the wind. It was the gift of the great beast of wisdom. His walls were lined with the heads of monsters he had slain. They were a record of a heroic life of conquest. He had chosen his son, Aga of Kish, to be the next leader. Aga was wise and virtuous, a worthy successor to the throne. Gilgamesh could feel his vitality ebbing away. Death was inevitable, Yet he found himself unwilling to let go. He took out the blood of the conqueror, the final gift. Only the world's greatest warrior could survive drinking it. He asked himself if he was truly that warrior. With a roar of defiance, he poured the liquid into an open wound on his arm. Pain beyond measure assaulted him. The hero of 100 battles rolled on the ground, gasping for air in pure agony. After what felt like an eternity, the change began. His coarse black hair receded, and his skin turned as white as ivory. He rose, transformed into a frost-white giant with the physique of a Greek god. The aging hero was gone, replaced by something divine. He tested his new power, lightly squeezing a bone handrail. It shattered instantly like fragile glass. Outside, his son Aga of Kish stood on a dais. He raised the sword of Damocles, proclaiming himself the new chief. Aga was a benevolent leader, far kinder than his father. Gilgamesh had once been willing to let him rule. Everything had changed. With his youth restored, Gilgamesh would not tolerate any challenge to his throne. He stepped forward, declaring that since he was back, the position of chief belonged to him alone. On that dark day, blood was spilled within the tribe. Wails of terror resounded through the air. Gilgamesh reclaimed his crown by killing his own son. His second life had begun with a tragedy that would haunt history. High above, Suji watched the brutal turn of events. The evolution of this civilization was taking a dark, unexpected path. The hero king had become a tyrant. The peace of the primitive age was shattered in an instant. Suji sipped his tea, reflecting on the power he had unleashed. One drop of gene serum had changed everything. He wondered if Gilgamesh would lead them to greatness or total destruction. The game of gods was only just beginning. The sandbox, the age of the immortal king, had dawned. A new era of fear and wonder was born. But for now, the creator was tired. He would watch the dawn of this new world from the comfort of his garden. The experiment was a success, but at what cost to the lives within? Gilgamesh was reaching the end of his life, his strength fading as age finally caught up to him. But he wasn't ready to let go of his crown just yet. He drank the blood of the conqueror, and in an instant, his youth was restored. The hero king was back, and his ambition was hungrier than ever. A decade passed, and the world began to change under his rule. The old wooden huts rotted away, replaced by permanent structures of cold, hard stone. Sumerians had officially entered the Stone Age, and at their head stood a king whose power defied the laws of nature. With the strength of termite genes flowing through him, Gilgamesh could uproot massive trees as if they were weeds. He could leap over mountains with a single bound. Physical might was absolute, a living god among mortals. But even for him, one challenge remained unconquered. 3 years later, he set his sights on the ultimate prey, the legendary behemoth, Finba. It was a beast that had haunted the dreams of his people for generations. The battle raged for 3 days and 3 nights, shaking the very foundations of the earth. Valleys crumbled and forests were leveled as they fought. The dust finally settled. Gilgamesh emerged triumphant. He returned home bathed in blood, dragging the mountain-sized corpse of the beast behind him. His tribesmen watched in stunned silence, their hearts swelling with a mix of pride and pure terror. Their king had slain a god. Standing atop his prize, Gilgamesh made a declaration that would change history forever. He was no longer just a chief. He was a founder. "I will build a kingdom," he told them. And with those words, the Sumerian dynasty was born. But history is written by the victors, and Gilgamesh was a master of the narrative. He carefully erased his sins from the records. The murder of his own son was forgotten, replaced by tales of valor and the slaying of the beast Finbar. The Sumerian epic became his gospel. He moved giant boulders with his own hands to build the city of Uruk. It was the first city-state in history, a monument to his ego. Time moved onward, and the invincible king turned his focus to civilization. He was a brilliant leader, but a cruel one. He developed currency and perfected language, but he also created the chains of slavery. He divided his people into classes, ruling with an iron fist. By the 87th year of his dynasty, Uruk had grown into a massive hive of tens of millions. The world had never seen anything like it. In the Grand Colosseum, nobles entertained themselves by watching slaves die against monsters. Cruelty had become the new entertainment. The cost of progress was paid in blood and suffering. And at the center of it all sat the man who started it. Deep within the royal palace, the air was thick with the scent of power. The walls were lined with golden wreaths and the fur of legendary beasts. Gilgamesh sat upon a throne made from the bones of Fenba himself. He looked as young as the day he drank the blood over a century ago. His minister, Dionysius, approached the throne with a heavy heart and a weary body. He had spent 30 years serving his king's vision. "Great king," he whispered, "we have finished exploring the entirety of the earth. The map of our world is finally complete." He described a world where the sky was a round arc and the earth was a perfect square. A vast ocean sat at the center, surrounded by mountains. It was a world so large that even the fastest beast would take 20 years to cross it. Gilgamesh listened, but his expression remained unreadable. "All right, stand down," the king commanded. Dionysius rose to leave, but he couldn't help but look back one last time. He remembered when he was a young warrior, full of fire. Now he was a trembling old man, while his king hadn't aged a single day. When the palace was empty, Gilgamesh drew his holy sword. The blade emitted a cold, mysterious light that felt alien to this world of stone. He caressed the metal like a lover. He had mastered the fire and the blood, but this metal remained a total mystery. In a world made only of earth and stone, there were no ores to find. This sword was the only one of its kind, a product of a higher civilization. Gilgamesh, it was a warning. The sword of Damocles hung over his head, a constant reminder of how little he actually knew. He remembered that day, a century ago. A colossus wreathed in divine light had granted him the 3 treasures of civilization. It had shown him the world and given him the power to rule. But the source of that power was still hidden in the shadows. Now, his life was coming to an end once again. The blood of the conqueror no longer worked on his aging body. He wanted to live a 3rd lifetime. He wanted to see the future he had built. But time was a thief he couldn't kill. "Great beast of wisdom, I want to see you again," he whispered into the silence of the hall. He was the mightiest king in history, but he was still just a man facing the inevitable. And his time was running out fast. Would the creator of civilization answer his call? Or would the hero king finally meet the end he had cheated for so long? While the world of the sandbox faced a crisis of mortality, Suji was simply enjoying a quiet meal. He chatted with Chun Shi, finding peace in the simple life of the countryside. He knew that all life inevitably ends in death, and even the greatest queens couldn't escape it. For a man with terminal stomach cancer, this was a truth he lived with every day. Looking at Gilgamesh's life, Suji couldn't help but feel a twinge of envy. The hero king had lived a glorious legend that would be remembered forever. He had 300 wives and a whole nation to mourn him. What more could a man possibly want from life? Suji decided it was time for a change of pace. He stood up, ready to head into town for some modern necessities. Chun-Shi laughed and offered him a ride on her scooter. She was eager to ask him more about his studies since they shared the same major. Suji didn't have a car. His medical bills had drained most of his savings. So, he happily shared the small seat with the cheerful girl. They spent the afternoon shopping for electrical appliances to make his farm life easier. To Suji, a modern life without a washing machine was simply too difficult. He assumed Gilgamesh would accept his end with the same calm dignity. After all, when death is inevitable, why not spend your final moments in peace? Suji had overlooked one crucial thing about human nature. Man is an animal that can never be truly satisfied. Having tasted a second life, Gilgamesh was now more terrified of death than ever before. The hero king desperately wanted a 3rd chance. The year 102 of the Sumerian dynasty, Gilgamesh was 142 years old. His body was finally beginning to fail him. In a panic, he issued a royal decree that shook the nation. He ordered a nationwide search for the great beast of wisdom. A massive reward was promised to anyone who could find even a trace of a deity. Gilgamesh was willing to sacrifice everything for a few more years. He summoned the world's wisest sages and black mages to his side. Their mission was simple: conquer death through any means necessary. The primordial forest became a slaughterhouse as beasts were hunted for their organs. Gilgamesh's obsession pushed entire species toward extinction. Black magic ran rampant as history entered a dark, tyrannical era. Every experiment was fueled by the king's growing desperation. In the year 113, a court mage finally succeeded. A potion made from rare beast parts managed to extend Gilgamesh's life temporarily. But the magic was a fleeting cure. After repeated doses, the potion lost its effect, and the king began to decline once more. By the year 145, the magnificent old man could feel his life force ebbing away. He sat motionlessly on his throne for 3 long days of meditation. Finally, he opened his aged eyes and made a shocking announcement. It was time to select candidates for the next king. The news hit the dynasty like a bomb. People couldn't believe that the immortal hero king was finally reaching his end. However, no one dared to step forward. They all remembered Aga of Kish, the son Gilgamesh had killed with his own hands after returning from the dead. Everyone feared that if Gilgamesh found another way to survive, he would surely execute his successor again. The throne felt like a death sentence. Seeing their fear, Gilgamesh offered a legendary prize. He would grant his successors the blood of the conqueror. He promised that if they possessed power equal to his, they would have no reason to fear him. They would even be allowed to build their own royal cities. The nation was electrified. Thousands of merchants, slaves, and nobles flocked to the palace, all dreaming of becoming the next king of Sumer. The trials were brutal. Most who drank the blood of the conqueror died instantly, unable to handle the overwhelming power within. Only 2 survived the ordeal: the forest warrior Enkidu and the grassland barbarian Ishtar. They alone possessed the strength to lead the next generation. They established 2 new city-states, preparing to take the mantle from the aging Gilgamesh. Civilization was ready to move forward, even without its founding father. By the year 175, the 3 royal cities lived in unprecedented harmony. But for Gilgamesh, the final hour had finally arrived. In a last struggle against fate, he built a temple more magnificent than any palace. It was dedicated to the great beast of wisdom. Inside stood a towering statue of the deity, holding a young Gilgamesh in its hand. It was a monument to the moment that had defined his entire life. Gilgamesh led millions of his subjects in worship, pleading for the Titan to hear his call. He wanted to see his creator one last time before the end. His voice cracked with emotion as he begged for an audience. 88 years had passed since their last meeting, and his heart was heavy with regret. "Great beast of wisdom, I want to meet you again," he cried out. But as his life faded, would the creator finally answer his desperate plea? Suji looked down at the miniature world he had built, marveling at the tiny civilization he had personally evolved. At the heart of it all stood a white-haired old man, weeping as he gazed toward the heavens. It was hard to believe this frail figure was the same hot-blooded teenager who once pointed a sword at the sky. Time had turned the ambitious youth into a man, simply waiting for his final breath. Suji remembered his arrogance and passion as if it were only yesterday. And for him, it practically was. It felt like endless centuries to these tiny beings had been a mere 2 days in Suji's world. The scale of their lives was heartbreakingly brief. Suji's voice finally broke the silence, thundering through the clouds and vibrating across the city of Uruk. He asked the old king how he had been after all these years. Gilgamesh trembled, his hand tightening around his divine sword. He whispered back that he had been well, though his voice was dry with awe. Sight was beyond words. A colossus thousands of feet tall loomed above, his body seemingly holding up the very heavens. His face shone like the sun emerging from behind the clouds, and his fathomless eyes surveyed everything below. To the mortals, he was matchless grandeur personified. Throughout the great city, life came to a standstill. Merchants, slaves, and nobles alike dropped what they were doing and rushed into the streets. They stared at the legendary great beast of wisdom, the being who had granted them the gift of civilization. Their minds went blank with overwhelming shock. Back at the royal court, Gilgamesh finally found his voice. He looked up with hungry eyes and declared that he had finished the mission given to him long ago. Suji stood tall, his thundering voice echoing through every corner of Uruk. He told Gilgamesh that his achievements would be recorded in the Epic of Genesis forever, promised that Gilgamesh would be remembered as the first and greatest king, the king of heroes. Future generations would sing his praise for eternity. But the king wasn't satisfied. He shouted back that he didn't want eternal glory after death. He didn't want to be just a legend. When the giant asked what he desired, Gilgamesh's answer was immediate. He wanted eternal life, just like the great beast before him. He begged for the 3 treasures of immortality, offering to give up everything he owned. He was a king who had everything, yet he lacked the one thing that mattered. Suji remained silent, feeling a pang of irony. He, too, was terminally ill and envied the glorious, epic life Gilgamesh had lived. He told Gilgamesh that he was being too greedy. Even a god couldn't change the natural cycle of life and death. In that moment, the gap between their civilizations vanished. They were just 2 pitiful souls, both shivering in the shadow of their impending ends. Gilgamesh's voice turned hoarse as he accused the giant of lying. He couldn't accept that this eternal being had no power to save him. He looked at the giant's youthful, mountain-like body and felt a burning resentment. Why did the great beast remain unchanged while he withered away? Suji sighed, explaining that he had only come to see him off and deliver a final warning. He told the king that his people had become too brutal. The Sumerians were destroying everything in their path, slaughtering great beasts and trampling the world. Suji demanded they stop their indiscriminate killing. Gilgamesh laughed, his eyes burning with an all-consuming flame. He told the giant that his advance would never be stopped. He spoke of the sword of Damocles that had hung over his head for years, granting power but also endless anxiety. Today, he intended to pull that sword down. He called for Akkad, the royal historian, to step forward. It was time to record a new, final entry in the Epic of Genesis. Akkad silently prepared his quill and spread out the gray leather scroll. He waited for his king's final, history-altering words. Gilgamesh declared that the history of man was a saga of courage against nature. He wanted future generations to know the strength of their ancestors. He commanded that his own courage in this very moment be etched into the records forever. The King of Heroes was ready for one last battle. He dictated the year, 175 of the Sumerian dynasty. A century after slaying the beast Fenba, the king was unsheathing his sword once more. He announced that he had lured out the great beast of wisdom himself. The entire nation would witness what happened next. With a dark smile, Gilgamesh gave his final order to the scribe. He was preparing to do the unthinkable. He was going to cut down God. First, he took the life of his own son. Now, Gilgamesh had set his sights on the creator himself. Suji looked down with a complicated expression. He should have seen this coming from the very beginning. Even as a child, Gilgamesh was the only one brave enough to challenge the Colossus. He never knew the meaning of fear. It was only a matter of time before he pointed his blade at his benefactor. This was simply his nature. Suji gave one final warning, calling for an end to this barbaric behavior. But the king of Uruk was beyond listening. Gilgamesh claimed that no punishment could be worse than death itself. The bloodlust of his youth had finally returned. He vowed to slay the great beast of wisdom and seize its power. He wanted the ultimate prize, true immortality. With a thunderous battle cry, he declared a clash of civilizations. The god of their race had now become their greatest obstacle. The distant ring of stone bells echoed through the streets. The entire royal city was waking up for war. Hundreds of thousands of troops surged forward in perfect formation. Gilgamesh had been preparing for this moment for over a decade. Suji realized the king had conscripted the entire nation just to draw him out. He was a tyrant, but an admirable one. Far away in the city of Uar, Ishtar watched the giant towering above the clouds. She knew the time for hiding was over. She understood Gilgamesh's plan perfectly. The tyrant would never have shared his power unless he needed help in this fight. With a graceful leap, she mounted her beast and prepared her weapon. A black stone hammer was ready to strike. Back in the city, the elder Zarn lay dying of old age. His time was running out, and his family could only watch in despair. Ishtar refused to let her family die while she had the power to stop it. She wasn't like Gilgamesh. She couldn't kill her own kin. She needed the blood of the immortal to save them. With a shout, She led her army of steppe riders into the fray. Meanwhile, at the divine tree, Enkidu stood in silence. He watched the massive titan from his high balcony. His disciples urged him to move, reminding him of his promise to the king. But Enkidu had made a different choice. He declared that they would defy the king's decree. They would not raise a hand against the being that gave them civilization. A disciple asked if he was afraid to die. Enkidu replied that he only feared losing his principles. Without morality, they would be nothing more than savage beasts. He could not attack the one who had shown them grace. He told Utnapishtim to take his head. It was the only way to pay for his insubordination and save his people. If Gilgamesh won, the head would satisfy the tyrant's law. But if the giant won, it would be a plea for forgiveness. With a single, decisive swing, the life of the great forest king came to an end. Enkidu passed away in peace. Utnapishtim carefully wrapped the head, his heart breaking with every movement. Something precious had been lost forever. Suddenly, the heavens shook. A rain of blood-red arrows and spears pierced the clouds, aimed at the titan. The earth convulsed under the weight of the conflict. Elite soldiers swarmed like ants beneath the giant's feet. Buildings collapsed like toy blocks as the city of Uruk turned into a bloody battlefield. Panic filled the air. The sounds of explosions and screams intermingled in a violent cacophony. No one was safe from the coming storm. The battle had finally begun. The mortals were challenging a god, and the world would never be the same. Gilgamesh stood at the center of it all, his resolve unshakable. He would have his immortality or die trying. The city he built was burning, but he didn't care. To him, this was the price of greatness. The clash of civilizations had arrived, and the outcome would decide the fate of all mankind. Suji stood before his creation, never expecting things to escalate this far. The mother hive's cold voice rang in his mind, asking if she should simply exterminate the rebels. He held absolute power over every creature he had evolved from the tyranny spores. These tiny bug apes were his to command, yet they now dared to defy him. He looked at Gilgamesh, who had assimilated termite genes to become stronger than any of his peers. Suji wondered if this power truly counted as ascending. The mother hive was blunt, explaining that the king had only taken the first step toward opening his genetic lock. True ascension meant perfect control over one's own sequence. Suji sighed, realizing that true power wasn't so easily obtained. Even with a planet full of spores, finding an ascended hero was like finding a needle in a haystack. These three leaders had managed to assimilate a second set of genes through sheer willpower. However, without ascension, they had already reached their absolute limit. Despite his potential, Gilgamesh had become arrogant and destructive. Suji couldn't allow this tyrant to ruin the sandbox's fragile ecosystem. He told the hive mind to stay its hand. He wanted to see personally how strong this self-proclaimed king had actually become. Strengthened by previous extinction events, Suji was no longer the sickly man he once was. His body had recovered, reaching the level of a healthy, fit adult. Gilgamesh had the proportionate strength of a termite, able to lift many times his weight. But to a human, he was still just the size of an insect. The earth rumbled as Sumer's elite army launched their attack. To Suji, their arrows were nothing more than a swarm of harmless gnats. Their spears stabbed futilely at his blue jeans, unable to pierce the thick fabric. It felt like walking through tall grass and getting tiny thorns stuck to his legs. Gilgamesh was shocked to see his elite soldiers failing so miserably. He realized that numbers meant nothing against the colossal size of the great beast of wisdom. Refusing to back down, the king leaped high into the air, leaving a white afterimage. He landed on Suji's boot and began a rapid, desperate ascent. In the blink of an eye, he had reached Suji's knees. The human was surprised by his speed, comparing the king's explosive power to that of Flea. Suji tried to swat him off like an annoying bug, but Gilgamesh was too agile, dodging the massive hand with the grace of a predator. The king gripped his sword, zigzagging up the woven fabric of jeans. To him, the rough denim was a mountain range with perfect footholds for climbing. Suddenly, Ishtar, the king of the steppes, joined the battle. She leaped onto Suji's leg, her muscular body covered in the scars of 1,000 victories. Suji watched as a second challenger began to scale his body. He decided it was time to end his little test of their strength. He moved his hand with a sudden, overwhelming speed. Before Ishtar could even react, she was swatted through the air like a common mosquito. She flew backward, coughing up blood as the mountain-sized palm crushed her momentum. In the next second, Suji turned his attention to Gilgamesh. A massive shadow loomed over the king as the palm descended like a falling sky. Gilgamesh cried out in shock, barely raising his sword to shield himself. The impact sent Gilgamesh's world spinning into chaos. He was launched backward, falling through the air like a stone dropped from the heavens. It climbed nearly a meter high, which for them was equivalent to falling from thousands of meters. Their small bodies plummeted toward the unforgiving earth. The impact shattered their bones and left them coughing in pools of their own blood. Yet, through sheer tenacity, they stubbornly clung to life. Suji looked down at his hand and was stunned to see a tiny, bleeding wound. Gilgamesh had actually managed to cut him before being swatted away. He marveled at the superb sword technique and the terrifying strength they possessed relative to their size. If they were human-sized, they would be true superhumans. He realized they were already at the level of heroes like the Incredible Hulk or Spider-Man. They had finally begun to develop genuine superpowers. Even so, an ant-sized superhero was no fatal threat to a human. The gap between their existences was still far too vast to bridge. Gilgamesh laughed miserably as he lay broken on the ground. He had lost in a single move, only managing to leave a tiny scratch on his foe. He gazed upward at the great beast of wisdom, who stood high above the clouds. The sight was both terrifying and divine. The fallen king, Suji's mighty form was cloaked in a blinding white light. A radiant halo seemed to rest upon the giant's brow. The entire army watched in silence as their gods were humbled. The reality of their insignificance finally began to sink in. Gilgamesh stared at the heavens, realizing the true nature of the being he had tried to kill. He had challenged a god, and the god had barely even noticed. Suji looked down at the fallen king with a heavy heart. Despite his total defeat, the man's pride remained absolutely unshaken. Gilgamesh was a brutal tyrant, yet he possessed a charisma that even a god couldn't ignore. Seeing his end draw near felt like a tragic waste of potential. But Suji was powerless to change the fate of a mortal. Without the third gene, the hero king was destined to fade away into the dust of history. Nearby, Ishtar coughed up blood, her body broken but her spirit burning bright. Even in the shadow of a titan, she refused to show a single flicker of fear. She laughed bitterly at the staggering power gap between them. She wondered what kind of impossible being they had actually dared to wage war against. Suji sighed, his massive form towering over them like a god from ancient myth. He asked them simply if they regretted the choices that led them here. Gilgamesh just laughed through his bloody coughs, shaking his head. They had made their choice, and for a king, regret was a luxury he couldn't afford. The Sumerian civilization had been utterly crushed by the great beast of wisdom. They knew the price of failure was nothing less than the end of their days. Suji looked down at the chaos below, watching soldiers run in madness. He never truly wanted to interfere with the rise and fall of an entire civilization. He remembered the savage bug apes who had once mocked him as Baldy the moment they were born. Back then, he had joked that they were a selfish, tyrannical race. Little did he know that his casual words would eventually become a dark reality. Their ambition had finally led them to the brink of extinction. Gilgamesh managed to sit up, his bones shattered but his spirit unbroken. He asked if the giant would now exterminate them like they had exterminated so many others. Hero King had never known fear, not as a youth, and certainly not now. Even facing death, he refused to beg for his life. Suji spoke, his voice booming like thunder across the ruins. Because they had destroyed the world's balance, he could no longer allow them to exist. Their unbridled reproduction had become a plague upon the land. They were like locusts, and the gardener had to prune the garden. Gilgamesh smiled miserably and made one final request. He asked for the chance to pose 3 final questions before the end. A heavy silence fell over the crowd as they waited for the Titan's response. The light from his brow pierced the clouds, painting the world in pure white. The great beast of wisdom remained inscrutable in his divine majesty. Then, his deep, ringing voice finally echoed through the ruins of Uruk. He gave his permission, and the world held its breath. The fleeing soldiers stopped in their tracks, looking up at the towering figure in the sky. Gilgamesh asked his first question with a bitter smile. He wanted to know exactly how the creator planned to destroy them. Suji thought about the sheer scale of the task. He couldn't let them continue like locusts, destroying everything he had built. He told them he would use water. A massive flood would wash away their sins and leave no trace of their existence behind. The world went still as the weight of his words sank in. To cleanse the entire world with a flood was a power beyond any beast. It was the power of a god. Then came the second question, born from a lifetime of searching. Gilgamesh asked where the Titan came from and what he truly was. He demanded to know why they were given the fire of civilization only to be stopped now. He asked what this land truly meant to the great beast. Suji looked into the king's eyes and gave him the truth. This land was a world he had created with his own two hands. He explained that all beings, plants, animals, and men, were his subjects. Before him, they were all perfectly equal. Gilgamesh was struck dumb, his voice lost in a wave of disbelief. The realization hit him like a physical blow. Suddenly, he burst into wild, mocking laughter that echoed through the ruins. He realized the great beast wasn't a beast at all. He was God. He laughed at his own arrogance for calling his records Genesis. He had thought himself a creator when the real creator had been standing over them all along. Finally, he asked his third and final question. He wanted to know how many days it took to create their entire world. Suji thought back to his week of gardening and answered with total honesty. It took him exactly 7 days to create this land. Gilgamesh froze, his mind reeling at the impossible truth. God had crafted the entire world in only 7 days. A hysterical laugh escaped his lips, mixed with bitter tears. Something deep inside the king finally snapped. In his final moments, his pride was utterly shattered. His consciousness drifted back to a memory from his childhood. He remembered standing on the palm of God, looking up with wide eyes. He had asked a single, profound question. What is civilization? God's voice had defined it as fire, knowledge, and order. It was the greatest weapon any intelligent species could possess. Gilgamesh realized now it was a force meant for protection, not for challenging the heavens. He started laughing again, the sound booming across the hills. Laughter carried over rushing rivers and verdant forests, reaching every corner of his empire. In the royal city, the people stopped and looked up in haunting silence. They could feel it in their souls, the dying breath of their king. Mournful songs began to rise from the streets as the people wailed in grief. On the borders of Uruk, the mythical hero king breathed his last. Suji looked down at the fallen ruler and let out a heavy sigh. He had never wanted this fight, but Gilgamesh refused to believe the truth. There was no treasure of immortality, only the harsh reality of mortality. Panic surged through the ranks as the cry went out that the king was dead. The most powerful hero in history had challenged God and lost. Soldiers fled in every direction, desperate to escape a wrath they couldn't understand. Suji didn't follow. There was nowhere in this small world for them to hide. Atop the walls of Uruk, the historian Akkad watched with trembling hands. Cold sweat poured down his face as he realized the magnitude of what he'd seen. He knew he had to document everything before his own end. He turned to a fresh page, his pen shaking as he began the epic of Genesis. He wrote that the great beast of wisdom was, in fact, the creator himself. Gilgamesh's arrogance had invited a divine judgment upon all of Sumer. In the city below, madness took hold of the grieving citizens. People fell to their knees, screaming for mercy and repenting for sins they barely understood. They feared the world would be washed away in a great flood. Just then, a young man in a black turban approached Suji with a grim offering. It was Utnapishtim, carrying the head of Enkidu. He knelt in the dirt, begging for the Creator's mercy on behalf of those who remained. He explained that Enkidu had chosen death over raising a sword against his benefactor. Not all Sumerians were guilty of the king's prideful rebellion. Suji felt a pang of regret for the chaos his presence had caused. He decided to give the survivors a single, slim chance at life. He commanded them to cut down the divine tree and build a massive ark. They were to gather seeds and breeding stock for every living thing. Use the remaining space for your tribesmen, he told the trembling disciple. Once the vessel was ready, the cleansing of the world would begin. As Su Ji walked away, a flicker of hope returned to the desperate people. They weren't being exterminated, just tested by the fire of divine will. They praised the sacrifice of Enkidu, the king of the forest. His virtue had stayed the hand of God and bought them a future. Akkad recorded this final act of benevolence with tears of joy. The Creator had shown mercy, and the legend of Noah's Ark was born in the sand. Back in the real world, Su Ji stepped into his quiet courtyard. It was time to finish the job and clean the sandbox for a new era. He reached for a high-pressure water gun he'd bought on a whim. He never expected a simple cleaning tool to become an instrument of apocalypse. 10 minutes in his world was over 100 days for the tiny Sumerians. They had worked feverishly, felling the divine tree to complete their vessel. The ark was packed with the records of their civilization and pairs of every beast. They waited in terrifying anticipation for the promised destruction. Su Ji squeezed the trigger, and a torrent of water erupted from the nozzle. To the tiny inhabitants below, the sky itself seemed to shatter. Massive trees were uprooted in seconds as the royal city collapsed like a sandcastle. The flood claimed everything in its path, turning the world into a white abyss. Napishtim watched from the deck of the ark as the land vanished beneath the waves. It looked as if the heavens had cracked open to pour out an endless sea. Soon, nothing remained but the foaming currents and the lone vessel. The world of Sumer was gone, buried under the weight of the Great Flood. The Great Flood fell like a white waterfall from the vault of heaven. It surged across the earth, drowning mountains and rivers in its path. On the deck of a massive ship, merchants and nobles watched in stunned silence. They couldn't believe the terrifying power unfolding before them. They believed God had sent this cleansing to wash away the sins of the world. Only the virtuous would survive the day of Armageddon. Napishtim and his people were the last sons of Sumerian civilization. Safely aboard their ark, they weathered the storm that destroyed everything else. In a quiet corner, the historian Akkad slumped down in shock. His hands trembled as he tried to process the divine power he had just witnessed. Tears clouded his old eyes as he contemplated the origin of their world. He picked up his pen to finish the Sumerian epic of Genesis. On the first day, God said, "Let there be light." And just like that, the light was separated from the darkness. On the second day, a firmament was created amidst the waters. Heaven was born, dividing the world above from the world below. The third day, the dry land appeared from beneath the waves. God called the land earth, and the gathering of waters the seas. On the fourth day, lights were placed in the heavens to divide day from night. A cycle began, alternating 50 years of light and 50 years of darkness. Finally, on the seventh day, God rested from all his work. He blessed these days, and his story became the gospel for all who survived. Survivors believed God had personally explained these secrets to them. But would a creator really lay down his pride for humble men? The people believed what they wanted to believe. They established a holy day of rest, following the legend of the seventh day. Beneath the surface, man-made structures crumbled like toy blocks. Every trace of the old Sumerian civilization was being washed away. Inside the sandbox, Su Ji finally stopped. He clicked the switch on his high-pressure water gun and set it aside. This was a fresh start for the world he created. The bug apes had pushed the ecosystem to the brink, and now the balance would be restored. He hoped they had learned to control themselves after this humbling experience. The sandbox needed a reset to survive. Hive Mind agreed, noting that the species would have self-destructed regardless. This extinction was the only logical course of action. Su Ji let out a long sigh of relief. He told the Hive Mind he wasn't as soft-hearted as it thought. The Hive Mind insisted he get used to this cycle of death and rebirth. It even called him the Tyranny's Queen. Su Ji snapped back, reminding the voice that he was male, not a queen. The Hive Mind argued they were all born from his spores. He quickly cut the conversation short, focusing on his own needs. He decided he needed to buy more fruit from town tomorrow. Picked up his black notebook to record the era. He had planned to call it the Behemoth Age, but the Sumerians had a better name. He wrote down Age of Genesis on the 4th page. It followed the Dark Age and the Radiant Age in his chronicles. He noted how the first intelligent species had built cities and expelled giants, but their cruelty led to the 3rd extinction event. After finishing his records, Su Ji went to sleep. He didn't know that his body was about to undergo a massive change. The next morning, he felt a frightening energy stirring inside him. He looked in a mirror and barely recognized himself. He had grown taller, and his sickly face had become elegantly handsome. He possessed a refined and mysterious aura now. Physique was robust, like a Greek sculpture. He felt as strong as Gilgamesh in his prime, brimming with explosive power. The gain from his 3rd extinction was several times greater than before. He was no longer a dying man. He was a powerhouse. Su Ji stared at his reflection, but he wasn't celebrating. He had gained a beauty that rivaled the gods, and it was going to be a massive headache. He knew she would lose her mind if she saw this sudden transformation. He looked like a mythical character straight out of a fantasy novel. If he walked outside like this, he'd be treated like a lab rat. He needed a way to hide this perfection before someone got suspicious. He called out to the mother hive, asking if he could modify his own genes. He wanted to dial back this overly handsome appearance. His neighbors had barely believed his last change. This new look was impossible to explain away as just growing more handsome. The mother hive responded with a question about Tyranny's cells. As the creator, he was already a Tyranny's hero with the power to unlock his genetic potential. He was shocked to realize he had already surpassed what countless others of that race aspired to be. The path to survival was right in front of him. His body had been too weak before, but now he was ready. He didn't want to wait for cancer to claim his life as a mere human. Being human had its limits, but as a Tyranny's, he could live on. He gave the command to integrate the cells immediately. Fusion began, and with it came a soul-searing pain. It felt like every fiber of his being was being rewritten. He groaned in agony as goosebumps broke out across his skin. Moments later, he lost consciousness and slumped onto the bed. 3 hours passed before he finally opened his eyes again. He felt heavy, and something was very wrong with his skin. He was covered from head to toe in a foul, black muck. It looked like he had been rolling in the mud during a fever dream. He scrambled to the bathroom to wash away the filth. As the water ran clear, he felt a strange new energy pulsing through him. He had become a proper Tyranny's. He could feel the limitless potential brimming within his very cells. A simple thought, he could now accelerate his cell division or tweak his own genetic code. He was no longer just a victim of fate. In his mind's eye, he saw the twisted double helix of his DNA. It was clean, optimized, and free of the junk data that plagued normal humans. Large sections of his sequence were now blank, ready to accept new traits. He saw the termite and gorilla genes in his database, but hesitated. Those genes didn't suit a peaceful farmer. His priority was his health, but when he checked his stomach, his face turned pale. His cancer had jumped to the final stage. Just days ago, it had only been in the middle stages. The mother hive explained the cruel irony. As the host grew stronger, the rebellious cancer cells grew stronger too. He realized that if he had absorbed any more energy from the last extinction, he'd already be dead. His own power was killing him. He couldn't risk another energy feedback for a long time. He had to let the ecosystem thrive naturally, even if the bug apes ran wild. He remembered Gilgamesh's desperate struggle and felt a kinship with it. He, too, was now facing the terrifying end of his time. The sandbox was quiet, still recovering from the great extinction. Decades had passed inside, but the bug apes were struggling to repopulate. They were following his words, treating other species with respect and limiting their hunting. But this slow pace was a problem for Su Ji. He ate the breakfast chun she had brought him, watching the tiny world. Civilization was developing again, but he didn't have much time left. He needed supernatural powers to appear in the sandbox. Only a miracle could cure his final stage cancer now. He considered opening a second sandbox to speed things up, but building everything from scratch would take far too much energy. He had to be patient, but intelligence was unpredictable. He couldn't force a supernatural evolution to happen on his own. Then a bold idea struck him. If his own intellect was limited, why not borrow the brains of others? He remembered a game called Spore that he used to play. In it, players evolved creatures from tiny spores into complex beings. He asked the hive mind if he could create a miniature sandbox and turn it into an online game. He wanted to conscript humans to help him. If people could project their souls into this world, they could help evolve new species at a lightning pace. It was a huge risk. He would create a game like no other, where the players were actually building a real ecosystem. His survival depended on their creativity. Second Genesis wouldn't be his burden alone. He was about to invite the entire world to play God. The plan was set. The era of the sandbox online game was about to begin, and the fate of his life was in the hands of the players.